are Amy and Ryan Green.
And we make video games together.
We're married.
Yeah.
So that's hard. Not the marriage, the making of the games as married people. The marriage, too. It's all
hard.
sometimes.
It's a difficult thing we do, right? We make video games. And we work alongside our team and business partner at Numinous Games to make video games.
And I think what we're probably most known for making is That Dragon Cancer, which was the story of our son who had terminal cancer, and just our journey in loving him and raising him while he was dying. We did port one scene from that into virtual reality, but then since then we've spent a year making an episodic, narrative, kind of quirky, fun game in virtual reality. So we've spent this year kind of immersed in virtual reality games.
And so we're coming to you here today as people that have both been the creative force behind a work that has been called an empathy game, as well as the subject of other works that people have done for empathetic purposes or personal purposes. So we wanted to share with you today what we've learned being part of that journey.
And we're just so excited to be here talking to you as the creators of virtual reality content, because I think about the people that have jumped into VR while it's still fairly new, and it seems to me like the people that jump into the newest technologies are kind of our generation's explorers. Like, we're the people who will go and talk to the king and get all the funding we need to take the voyage just to go and see what is out there and what can we do. And so that gets me really excited to talk to this group of people, because I'm sure that when the next technology comes, we're going to be the same people that jump into that one and say, oh, what can we do with this?
And what I love about coming to this event is that I look out here and I see a group of missionaries, and all intent on spreading the gospel of what you believe in and the ways that you want to make the world a better place.
But then I think we have to be a little bit careful, because when we look at explorers and missionaries, when they set out with all their good intentions to go and explore new worlds, the legacy that they had was pretty crummy. History judges them very harshly for choices that they made, because whether intentionally or unintentionally, they took advantage of people. They misunderstood cultures. They just weren't careful enough. And so I want us to think about, as we're jumping into these new technologies and we have this missionary heart to make VR that can create empathy, that can change people, that we are careful enough, that we consider our legacy from the very beginning.
So let's talk about VR. Chris Milk, one of our godfathers, I guess you would call him, famously said that the VR is perhaps the ultimate empathy machine. And this isn't the first time that empathy has been kind of bandied about, because as video game developers, we've been part of I would say, a class of video games that have been talked about in these terms, that empathy becomes this feature that we can add on to interactive activities without really realizing that just the act of story itself is an empathetic act.
There was initially a lot of excitement about the potential of empathy games, and I think the press became very enamored with this idea that, oh, what if games aren't just bad for society? What if they can do some good? And it must be through these empathy games. But what we've seen is that kind of wave of excitement is starting to dissipate, and people are starting to have some real criticism about empathy. They begin to ask questions like, what if this is really just appropriation of a culture that you don't understand? Or is this just a way for privileged people to feel less guilty because they can say, oh, no, I totally understand homelessness because I put on a headset once and I tried that for 10 minutes. People are saying that this is not enough. And people are asking, is this really just a money grab? Which some of these criticisms, I think, aren't fair.
Because we know that, as being one of you and being part of this community, that we don't get into this business and we don't try to tell our stories for mercenary purposes. We're here because we believe in our cause and we want to share our story.
And because people are spending years of their life, their heart, their money to make these games that are never going to be a blockbuster. If you're making an empathy game, you know you're not going to be able to buy a house off of that empathy game. You'll be lucky to pay for that empathy game. So we know the criticism isn't always fair, but it can't be totally ignored, because if people are starting to say these things, that's one of those signs that as the explorer that wants to just dive in, maybe you should take a step back and be just a little more cautious and ask yourself, What is it about these experiences that aren't resonating the way that we hoped they would? What is it that's feeling cheap to certain people?
And if we look at the other side of the coin, and we look at this desire to use technology, and albeit very expensive technology, to convince a group of people that should care already that they're being jerks, or that they should care about people, is kind of a ridiculous notion. But I think one thing that we should consider is that that not everybody, like including myself, like I can put myself on here and say that, like, before childhood cancer came to us, before Joel got sick, I didn't want to look at childhood cancer. And I think a lot of people come into these subjects with a lot of fear, with a lot of baggage, with a lot of trepidation about what it is that they will have to face. It will cost your players and your viewers something to engage with your content. And that something might be very profound.
So we can criticize people for needing a VR experience to care because they should care already. But all of us only care about what we know and what we've experienced. You can't fault people for that. You have to start somewhere. But we asked, like, so what is it that's feeling cheap and not connecting? And I think part of it comes down to that what we're trying to package as an empathy game is not the same as how we actually change in real life. Because in our personal lives, it's not empathy that compels us to compassion, it's intimacy. Empathy is defined as understanding another person by considering their point of view. But I think that's tough for people. Some of the outcry that we get about these empathy games is, look, you don't understand me because you put a headset on. And honestly, you can never understand me because you don't have my perspective. To assume that you can adopt my perspective by just thinking about it really carefully is a little bit belittling, because you don't know what it's like to be me, and you can never know what it's like to be me. So just from the very definition of the word empathy, something is falling a little bit short. And so while in real life we can't just like actually understand people by vividly imagining their experience, what we can do is we can get close to them. We can become intimate, and that intimacy can lead to compassion.
Right, and so compassion means to suffer with. And remember what I said about our players and our viewers and our audience. They have to choose to suffer with the people that we are depicting, the stories that we are telling.
So that suffering with is important. It's a step that we sometimes don't take. It's the difference between, I think the difference between empathy and compassion, that I'm going to imagine your experience versus I'm going to walk with you through your experience, is something that we noticed when we had to announce that our son had died. There were people in our community, people who loved us, who read that probably on Facebook or in the newspaper and thought to themselves, oh, can you even imagine how hard that must be? And that's how far it went. They vividly imagined or refused to imagine what our pain must be, and they stopped there. And then there's the people who came to our home and who sat with us, who spent days with us talking and joking and sharing memories, who brought food. They suffered with us. They said, I don't just want to imagine what their pain is like. I want to be with them in that pain. Not as us, but drawing close to us. I'll let you. I think part of this is that you have to let the work change you.
Yeah. I was playing a game once with somebody, or I was playing their game, and it was about a very moving subject. It was about a very intimate subject, and I played the game, and I didn't feel that. And so afterwards, I stood up and I asked them, "Do you know anybody with this condition?" Well, no, I don't know anybody because I don't really want to get too close because I don't think that I could handle it. There was this reservation from the creator's side that even though what they were doing was a noble act, that they weren't letting themselves become close enough to the subject to be able to let it change them.
And so we can't create works that we hope are going to change our audience if we won't let those same things we want to talk about change us. If you're not close enough to the subject you want to talk about to be just totally wrecked by it, then you're not going to be able to create something intimate enough to introduce that to people. We also had people who, knowing that we had a child with cancer, even knowing that we'd made a game about our child with cancer, would come up to us and say, oh, I want to make a game, and there's going to be a character with cancer. Can you just tell me what it was like to have a kid with cancer? And you laugh because it's silly, and it felt silly to us too. Like, you want me to write down 3 or 4 sentences that'll help you make this game. You don't want to come with me on hospital rides. You don't want to sit with me while I give IV medications in the middle of the night. You just want my quick thoughts. Okay. We had another person say they wanted to make a game about parenthood. And they didn't have kids, so they asked me and a bunch of people, can you just give me your biggest, best memories about being a parent? And it's hard, because we all know as parents, I can't sum it up for you in a sentence or a paragraph or several paragraphs.
How about you come over next time he has croup,
yes.
and you hold them at night, wondering if they'll breathe?
It's not that you can't make a story about something you haven't experienced. I think it would have been totally fair for the same person to say, look, I don't have kids. I'm not sure if I'll ever have kids, but I want to tell this story. Can I come with you to the grocery store with 4 screaming kids, one of whom should have had a nap and didn't? Can I spend some time in your life? Can I suffer with you? And then he can tell my story in a much more accurate way, because he's been a part of my life. He's not just conjecturing or imagining what it might be like.
And one thing that act does is it allows you to suffer with, to come alongside, to make that subject of your stories an active part of telling the story. I think as storytellers, we think of ourselves perhaps as the only storyteller, but our willingness to instead set aside what we want to say in the purpose of the story you're telling, of the subject, or of the people that you're with, is important.
We have the criticism sometimes that perhaps these empathy games are appropriation, that you're just taking someone else's life or their culture and their story, and you're sharing it when you don't have permission to. And one great way to avoid that is to be close enough to someone to find out if they want you to tell their story. And if they want you to tell their story, then you're doing an amazing thing by helping them tell their story. It helped us to be able to share our story through our grief and pain. That was an important tool for us. And it's something we're passionate about, being able to help other people tell their stories. And there were people who came alongside us and helped tell our story, because while we made this video game, only a certain kind of person is going to play this video game. But people took the story of us and our video game and told it in other mediums so that it reached a different audience.
And one thing that amazed us was, well, this is kind of a terrifying thing, because we are a couple with a sick child from the Midwest. We're religious people, and we have certain ideas about God and certain ideas about miracles and prayer and all of these different things. And so to have somebody from the outside, like big city New York here, come and spend time with us, there was a certain amount of trepidation with us of how do we trust that these people are going to have our best interests at heart? And what we found is that almost everybody had our best interest at heart. And that was very encouraging for us, because it allowed us to tell the story, tell our story, and allowed their lens to be present, that relationship to be present when we told our story. And so what came out was this piece by Jason Tanzan, Wired, which was amazing to us, because what happened is he came, he spent time with us, he went to the game conference with us, he spent time at home with us, with our family, and he got to know us. And through that, he dug deeper. He understood why we were saying the things that we were saying. What was the root of our belief that caused these things? Who were these authors that we were referencing? And he read them and found deeper things about them and referenced them in the article. And so what he did is he took, he created this compassionate and empathetic act by taking on our worldview and using it as the framework for expressing our story.
So he told our story the way we thought of it, even though it wasn't how he thought of the world. And it was so obvious when people came to tell our story and didn't do this. Yeah. Sometimes people came with their own agenda, and they'd ask certain questions that were kind of leading the story a certain way, and you could tell they were disappointed when our story didn't match the story they wanted to tell. Sometimes they would ask Ryan, did you do this game as a source of therapy? Was this therapeutic for you? And the answer was usually that it really wasn't. But you could tell they were disappointed, because that was the story they wanted to tell, was Dad makes game as therapy. Or people will say, is this game for kids? Does it help them cope with grief? And we had to say, well, no, this really isn't a game for kids, and I don't know that we recommend it for kids. who currently have cancer, because we wouldn't have wanted to play this when our child had cancer. And you could just tell when someone didn't want to set down their agenda and tell our story, when they wanted to tell their own story. And they were hoping that we would be a tool that they could use to tell the story they wanted to tell. And so that's just another thing, I think, to keep in mind if you want to tell a story that changes someone, is set down your agenda, really find out what the story is. There's a compelling story in every person's life. Find it, instead of trying to take their life and apply it to the story you're hoping to tell.
One thing that was very important to us in creating that Dragon Cancer was that people not feel that their decisions could affect whether or not Joel lived or died. And some of that comes with a little bit of criticism, because by removing agency from the game, by removing choice from the game, the question becomes, well, does that make it a game? Does that make it a video game? And I think that we have to look at, when we are creating VR experiences, we're inviting other people. I'm inviting you into my life. And so if I'm asking you to be me, I can't ask you to be me, you're you. And so we made decisions in that Dragon Cancer that rather than putting people, and sometimes we'd put them in our shoes, but for the most part, we'd put them in your own shoes. And we'd ask you to care for Joel. That your goal was to care for and love Joel, not make decisions about Joel's care.
So just as a design principle, when we're talking about, well, what's really the difference between empathy and compassion? Because even though we talked about the very different definitions those words have, they're used pretty interchangeably. But the difference in design here would be empathy. If you're trying to say, just imagine what it's like, really vividly imagine it, then you might cast them as the character in the role you want to talk about. So let's say it's homelessness. Then you're like, you're the homeless guy, and we create this homelessness simulator, and you're dealing with all the circumstances a homeless person might deal with, so you can really imagine what it's like to be them. And an intimacy approach, a compassion approach, might be that you're someone in relation to a homeless person. You're someone who's helping them, who's having them over for dinner, who's just drawing closer and closer to a real character within the story and a narrative. And I think the difference becomes pretty obvious for the player, because if you make me the homeless man, I'm going to look for the win state in that situation. I'm going to try to be the best homeless man I can and make the very best decisions. And in the end, I don't end up with more compassion. I end up saying, well, was it just the choices they made? Even I think most of the empathy sort of simulators, the goal is, I think, for the player to have a takeaway moment of, oh, that's harder than I thought. Oh, maybe that's not a winnable situation. And that aha moment comes, but maybe only after 20, 25 minutes of like trying really hard to make the right choices as this person. Whereas if you just play as someone in relation to another person, that's something you can put into practice in your day-to-day life. I don't get to, in my life, ever become a person I'm not. But I can definitely, in my real life, practice becoming closer to people that maybe I wouldn't normally get close to. I can practice seeking people out who are outside of my community. I can practice being an advocate and a friend. If I get to practice that in games and apply that in my real life, that's powerful. But I think sometimes when we just simulate an experience in a game, there's no way to take that into our real life as easily.
And so just as we're asking you to love the subjects of our empathy, to love the people whose stories we're telling.
And to intimately know them so that they change you.
We'd like to ask you to love your audience as well. And I think that's difficult because a lot of times we get into this phase because we want to convince people of their wrongness. And I even admit that even in our own game, there was this sense of, I want to show you how much what I believe is the best thing. And I want to show you like how to make things happen. And in reality, by going through this experience myself, I entered into a pain, and we entered into a journey that we never thought we'd take. And what came out of that was a much different story than what we started with.
And I think this can be really tricky to say, I want you to be changed by your audience, because if you're making a game to change a point of view, it's probably because you think that the point of view they hold isn't right. So let's say you're making a game about equality for an audience that you perceive to be racist. What does it mean for me to say, love those people you perceive to be racist and intimately know them? that's a tough call. You have to let them change you like you're letting the subject change you. And what I mean by that is that you need to not just go with your perception of like, they're racist and it must be because they're jerks. You're going to have to go find out, they're racist. Why? Why are they racist if that's what I believe they are? Is it something that they were taught? Is it an experience that they had? If you find the heart of why they believe the thing, then you can craft a story that's designed to go right to their heart. And if you make assumptions about what their heart is, you'll craft a story that may miss them entirely. It might be a beautifully constructed story, but not for your audience, because you never took the time to know them and to let them change you. Let who your audience is change your story. Let it make you draw back sometimes instead of giving that final punch, because that might be what's most effective.
On the other hand, it might be the most effective, but you need to know where to punch. And so I don't think that loving your audience means being kind or being too gentle with them or treating them with kid gloves. I think the point is that we have to know who we're speaking to and who we're trying to convince to be able to convince them of anything.
And so as much as you have let the subject of your game change you, you have to let your audience change you at least that much if you have a targeted audience, which if you're making VR empathy games for change, you have to have both sides of that, and that can be a tough position to be in.
And so we hope that the future of VR will be filled with relationship, will be filled with compassion, will be filled with the intimacy needed to evoke real change in the world.
Thank you very much.